Listen. I am Mama Otomba, and I have carried the voices of the dead inside my bones ever since the moon of the Red River rose above my village when I was a little girl, with bare feet and smoke in my lungs from the sacred fires of my grandmother. And now I sit here in Harlem with old fingers wrapped around cold tea, while winter rain taps against my apartment window on Lenox Avenue, and the city below groans with the sound of tired buses, drunken laughter, and lonely jazz crawling out of basement clubs like wounded spirits searching for a grave. I was already an old woman in the year the radio came into my possession, though some folks in Harlem said I had been old since the first trumpet ever cried beneath these streets, and perhaps they were right, because sorrow ages a soul faster than time itself. The year was 1957, and Harlem was changing its face again. The bright silk nights of the jazz kings had begun to fade into darker things. Men still played saxophones under blue smoke clouds. Women still wore velvet gloves and perfume heavy as funeral flowers, but the laughter had become nervous, thin, hollow around the edges. White policemen walked slower through our streets now, staring harder into our windows, and many of the old musicians had become ghosts before they even died. Some drank themselves into silence, while others vanished into alleyways with needles hanging from their arms like cursed vines. Harlem had always been haunted, but by then the spirits were multiplying. I lived above a pawnshop owned by a bitter Puerto Rican man named Emilio, who never smiled and smelled of cigar, ash, and spoiled onions. My apartment was small, with cracked yellow walls and wooden floors that moaned whenever I walked across them during the night. Every corner held charms from my homeland. Cowrie shells hung above the doorway. Bone necklaces rested beside candles blackened with wax and prayer smoke. Little carved ancestor figures sat near my bed, their hollow eyes always watching. Some people in Harlem called me a witch. Others called me healer. Most simply called me Mama Otomba, because when sorrow enters a neighborhood, it eventually finds the oldest woman still willing to listen. I cleaned wounds. I whispered blessings over frightened children. I burned herbs for lonely widows and spoke prayers over dying men whose families could not afford churches. I knew the old spirits from the desert lands beyond the Niger River, and though America tried to beat such memories out of our blood long ago, spirits are stubborn things. They travel where suffering travels. The radio came to me on a Thursday evening while rain flooded the gutters and Duke Ellington drifted faintly from the nightclub, 3 buildings down the street. A young trumpet player named Isaiah brought it to my apartment wrapped in a stained blanket. Isaiah was beautiful in the tragic way doomed men often are. Tall and dark-skinned, with gold eyes that never seemed entirely awake, as though part of his spirit wandered somewhere far from his body. His cheeks had become thinner over the previous months, and his hands shook sometimes when he lit cigarettes, but when he played his trumpet, the whole street held its breath. Even the prostitutes leaning from windows stopped talking when Isaiah performed at the Blue Lotus Club. That boy could pull grief out of brass. He entered my apartment dripping rainwater onto the floorboards and said nothing at first. He simply stared at the radio sitting inside the blanket. I remember the smell around him that night. Wet wool, whiskey, sweat, and something else beneath it all. Sand. Dry sand. Desert wind. It should not have been possible in the middle of Harlem rain, yet I smelled it clearly. My chest tightened the moment I noticed it. "Mama," he finally whispered. "I think something evil followed me home." His voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. Not even heroin addicts trembling outside church steps sounded like that. This was deeper. Ancient fear. The kind that enters through bloodlines. I asked him where he got the radio. He swallowed hard before answering. "A junk dealer down near the docks sold it to me cheap 3 nights ago. Said it came from Louisiana after some rich white collector died." He rubbed his eyes with shaking fingers. "At first it only played static. Then last night I heard music." I looked at the radio carefully while thunder rolled somewhere over the city. It was old even for those days, made of dark polished wood with brass knobs tarnished green from age. Strange markings had been carved along the sides. Not English. Not French. Symbols curved like snakes twisting through fire. My stomach turned colder. I had seen similar markings once before, as a child beside a dying man in Timbuktu who had stolen relics from forbidden burial caves beneath the desert. What kind of music? I asked quietly. Isaiah stared at me too long before speaking again. Drums. My candle flames flickered violently at that word. Not jazz drums, older, slow at first, then faster, like something marching closer. Rain hammered the windows harder. Somewhere downstairs, Emilio shouted angrily at somebody in Spanish, but his voice sounded very far away suddenly. Isaiah leaned closer to me and lowered his voice to barely more than a breath. Mama, the radio speaks to me. I said nothing. He continued, it only speaks after midnight. Sweat rolled down his forehead though the room was cold. I hear a woman's voice inside it. At first she whispered in another language, but yesterday I understood some English. He paused, unable to look me in the eyes now. She keeps saying my name. The room fell silent except for the storm outside. I slowly stood and approached the radio. My knees ached as I moved. Age had filled my bones with old fires. Up close I noticed scratches around the tuning dial. Deep scratches, desperate scratches, as though somebody had clawed at the thing trying to silence it forever. Then I saw something worse. Dried blood inside the grooves near the speaker cloth. Very old blood. My fingers brushed against one of the carved symbols and pain shot through my hand like a needle of ice. I jerked backward instantly. The candle flames near my ancestor altar turned blue for one terrible second. Isaiah gasped. I already knew then that the spirits around this object were not the wandering dead of Harlem. No. These were older things. Hungrier things. Spirits carried across oceans through slavery, violence, greed, and forgotten rituals buried beneath centuries of suffering. There are some doors the dead should never open again. Did you listen to the voice? I asked him. Isaiah nodded slowly. Last night she told me to come to the river. What river? The Hudson. His voice cracked. She said somebody was waiting for me beneath the black water. A horrible silence spread through my apartment. Even the rain seemed quieter suddenly. Then, without warning, the radio turned on by itself. Static exploded through the room so loudly, Isaiah stumbled backward against the wall. My candles dimmed at once. The air became dry and scorching hot like desert wind blowing through a tomb. And beneath the static I heard it too. Drums. Slow drums. Ancient drums. Then came the woman's voice. Soft. Whispering. Hungry. Isaiah. My blood froze solid because the voice was not coming from the speaker alone anymore. It was moving through the room itself. Crawling across the walls like smoke. Isaiah. The trumpet player began crying silently beside me. I reached for the ancestor necklace around my throat and whispered prayers in the old language of my grandmother, but deep inside my heart I already understood something terrible. Whatever lived inside that radio had crossed a great distance searching for someone, and now it had found him. Isaiah dropped to his knees beside my table while the voice continued slithering through the apartment like invisible fingers brushing against our skin, and I remember the way the room smelled then. Not merely of desert sand anymore, but of graves left open too long beneath a cruel sun, where forgotten bones crack under heat and spirits wander thirsty between worlds. The radio hissed louder until the wooden cabinet itself began trembling on the floorboards. My candles bent sideways as if pushed by unseen breath. Outside, Harlem still lived its ordinary night with distant taxi horns and nightclub trumpets floating through rain. But inside my apartment another place had opened itself. Another time older than America and crueler than memory. I seized the bowl of ash resting beside my ancestor altar and scattered gray powder toward the radio while speaking the protection chants my grandmother taught me beside river fires long ago. The voice inside the static shrieked, then no longer sounding entirely human. Isaiah covered his ears and cried out in terror. For one instant the speaker cloth bulged outward as though something inside was trying to force its face through the fabric. Then silence came all at once. Heavy silence. The kind that presses against the chest. Only the rain remained outside. Isaiah looked up at me with eyes full of helplessness. Mama, what is it? I wished I could lie to him. Old people sometimes lie to the young to protect them from truths too dark to carry. But fear already wrapped itself around that boy like chains. Lies would not save him now. I sat slowly across from him and stared at the radio. "There are spirits," I whispered, "that belong neither to heaven nor earth. Spirits born from pain too great for death to bury. Some attach themselves to places, others to bloodlines. And some—" I paused because even speaking such things aloud felt dangerous. "Some attach themselves to objects." Isaiah wiped tears from his face with trembling hands. "Why me?" The question broke my heart because I had asked the same thing many years earlier when slave ghosts first began whispering outside my childhood hut during fever seasons. Why us? Why suffering? Why the chosen are always the wounded? I studied him carefully. "Tell me everything that happened after you brought it home." He nodded weakly and began speaking while thunder rolled over Harlem rooftops again. The first night had seemed harmless enough. He placed the radio in his apartment beside the window and spent hours trying to tune stations through static. Around midnight he heard faint drumming beneath the noise. He thought perhaps some station from Cuba or New Orleans drifted through the storm air. Then came the woman singing softly in a language he did not understand. He fell asleep listening to it. The dreams began immediately. He dreamed of endless dunes beneath a black moon where faceless men carried drums made from human skin. He walked behind them, unable to stop moving. Ahead stood a city buried halfway beneath sand. Towers shaped like bones rose against the sky, while thousands of shadowy figures knelt around enormous fires. In the center of that city sat a woman wearing gold jewelry around her throat and white paint across her eyes. She smiled when she saw him. "You came back," she whispered in the dream. The second night worsened. He woke to find sand scattered across his apartment floor despite locked windows. The radio had turned itself on again. This time the woman spoke English. She knew his name. She told him she had waited for him through the centuries of water. Isaiah tried throwing the radio away into an alley behind the club, but hours later it sat once again inside his apartment beside his bed. By the third night, he stopped sleeping altogether because every time he closed his eyes, he heard drums approaching through darkness. He began seeing strange figures standing at street corners watching him, tall black silhouettes wearing tribal masks. Nobody else seemed to notice them. Then musicians at the Blue Lotus Club started avoiding him. One piano player swore he saw smoke pouring from Isaiah's trumpet during a performance. Another claimed shadows moved around him beneath the stage lights. And still the voice kept calling, "Come to the river." When he finished speaking, his face looked gray with exhaustion. I walked to the window and stared down at Lenox Avenue glistening beneath rain. Harlem at night always reminded me of wounded royalty. So much beauty buried beneath suffering. Men in fine suits stumbling drunk beside homeless veterans. Women wearing diamonds over bruised skin. Music pouring from clubs where broken souls tried dancing against despair. Spirits loved such places because pain leaves doors open. "Did the woman ever tell you her name?" I asked quietly. Isaiah hesitated. "Yes." His voice nearly vanished. "Nabira." The moment he spoke that name, every candle in my apartment extinguished at once. Darkness swallowed the room. Isaiah screamed. Outside, lightning flashed white through the window, and for one terrible instant I saw another woman standing beside us, reflected in the glass. Tall, thin, wrapped in flowing desert cloth, her eyes completely white. Then the darkness returned. I grabbed Isaiah's wrist and ordered him not to move. My heart hammered like war drums inside my chest. I knew that name. Dear God, I knew it. My grandmother once told stories of Nabira beside our village fires, when I was a child too young to understand fear properly. A priestess from ancient caravan kingdoms swallowed by the Sahara centuries ago. Some called her healer. Others called her eater of souls. Legend claimed she discovered ways to trap spirits inside sound itself. Drums. Songs. Voices carried forever through objects touched by ritual blood. Slave traders later carried fragments of those forbidden rites across oceans where they mixed with voodoo practices in the Americas. Most knowledge died with the old generations. But not all. Some curses survive because human cruelty feeds them endlessly. I lit another candle with shaking fingers. Isaiah stared at me desperately. "You know her?" I nodded slowly. or I know the shadow of what she became. Rain continued striking the windows while jazz music drifted faintly from the nightclub below. Somewhere far down the avenue a police siren wailed like a grieving animal. I suddenly felt very tired. Old age teaches a person when destiny has finally knocked upon the door. You cannot keep this radio, I told him. It must be destroyed. His relief came too quickly. Then let's smash it. No. I turned sharply toward him. Not like ordinary wood. Fear returned to his eyes. Then how? Before I could answer, footsteps creaked slowly across the hallway outside my apartment. Both of us froze. The footsteps stopped directly beside my door. Then came 3 soft knocks. Not loud. Gentle. Patient. I approached carefully while clutching the ancestor necklace around my throat. Who is there? Silence answered me at first. Then a woman's voice whispered through the wood. Isaiah belongs to me. My blood turned to ice. Isaiah backed away whimpering. The voice outside continued softly, almost lovingly. He crossed the water once before. He promised he would return. The doorknob began turning slowly, though I had locked it hours earlier. I started chanting protection prayers again, louder this time, and smoke suddenly burst from my altar candles despite no fire touching them. The hallway outside filled with a strange scraping sound, like hundreds of dry bones dragged across stone. Isaiah fell to the floor praying aloud. The doorknob twisted harder. Then the radio came alive again. Static exploded through the apartment while drums pounded violently from the speaker. The walls themselves vibrated with the rhythm. And over the terrible noise came trumpet music. Isaiah's trumpet music. But twisted now. Wrong. It sounded like jazz played at the bottom of a grave. The voice inside the radio laughed softly. Open the door, Mama Otomba. I will confess something now that I never admitted to another soul while alive. In that moment, despite all my years speaking with spirits and guiding mourners through darkness, I became truly afraid. Because I understood the thing hunting Isaiah was no wandering ghost. No lonely dead woman trapped inside machinery. This was something ancient wearing memory like a mask. Something that had followed black suffering across continents and centuries, feeding itself upon grief, music, longing, and blood. And somewhere deep inside the static, beneath the drums and whispers, I could hear other voices too. Thousands of them. Crying. Begging. Trapped forever inside the sound. The knocking at my door stopped the moment I pressed my palm against the wood. But silence did not return because silence had already been eaten by the sound inside the radio. And now even my thoughts felt crowded, as though invisible travelers were walking through my memories searching for cracks to slip into. Isaiah was still on the floor whispering prayers in a voice that barely belonged to him anymore. And I knew if I did not act quickly, whatever stood outside would not need permission to enter because it was already inside the rhythm of the house itself. I moved away from the door and went straight to my ancestor altar. Taking down the small clay bowl filled with river ash and dried roots, then I placed it beside the radio and began something I had not done in many years since leaving Africa, a calling that requires blood memory more than words. I bit the inside of my palm until copper filled my mouth and let 3 drops fall into the ash while speaking the names of my grandmother's line, one by one, until the air in the room thickened like oil. The radio screamed in response, not through sound alone but through pressure, as if the entire apartment was being submerged underwater while still standing dry. Isaiah suddenly stopped praying and gasped because he could see it too now. The shape forming in the static, the outline of a woman taller than any living body, should be her face shifting between beauty and bone, her eyes like empty desert wells reflecting stars that did not belong to this sky. The voice that came next was no longer distant or hidden inside machinery. It stood with us. Mama Otomba, it said gently, almost respectfully, you still carry old fire in your hands. I answered it in the language of my childhood. Words shaped from wind and smoke and buried rivers, and the apartment windows shook, as if struck by invisible fists. Isaiah crawled toward me, grabbing my skirt, begging me to stop. But I could not because once a name like Nabira is spoken aloud in its full recognition, the bridge between worlds is already built, and something will cross it, whether you want it or not. The radio lifted slightly from the floor without any hands touching it, hovering just above the wooden boards while the carved symbols along its sides began to glow faintly like embers under ash. Then the voice changed again, softer, almost mournful. "He is mine because he remembered me," it whispered. "Long ago, before this city, before this body, before this suffering street of music and smoke, he belonged to the drum." Isaiah shook his head violently, crying that he had never been anywhere but Harlem, that he had never seen deserts or fires or ancient cities. But the woman inside the air laughed, and the sound carried memories that were not his own flooding into him anyway. I saw his body stiffen as if another life was being poured inside him against his will. And suddenly he was no longer only Isaiah, the trumpet player from Lenox Avenue, but something older flickering behind his eyes, a shadow of a man walking beside caravans beneath a black sky. I knew then what Nabira truly was, not just a spirit but a collector of echoes, feeding on reincarnated fragments of souls who once heard her drums in forgotten ages. The radio began to split down the middle, wood cracking open like old skin, and from inside it came sand, real desert sand, spilling across my floorboards in a slow, endless stream, forming patterns that looked like maps to buried kingdoms. I stepped forward and placed my hand directly over the radio speaker and began the final binding chant, not to destroy her but to force recognition, because spirits like her cannot be killed, only named fully and reflected back into their origin. The air exploded with sound, jazz trumpets mixed with tribal drums, Harlem nightclubs merging with desert fires, every rhythm ever stolen or transformed screaming at once until the apartment itself felt suspended between worlds. Nabira appeared fully then, no longer fragmented, standing in the center of my room, wearing cloth that shifted between ancient linen and modern shadow, her presence bending light around her like heat above sand. She looked at Isaiah with something like tenderness and hunger intertwined. "You always return to me," she said. I stepped between them. "He is not yours in this life," I said firmly, though my voice trembled because even old women are still made of flesh. She tilted her head as if amused. "Everything that hears the drum becomes mine eventually." I struck the radio with the iron charm from my altar, not as violence but as completion, and the sound that followed was not breaking but release, as if 1,000 trapped voices exhaled at once. The radio collapsed inward rather than outward, folding into itself until it became a small burning point of soundless light that pulsed once, twice, then vanished. The sand on my floor stopped moving. The drums stopped. Even the rain outside paused for a breathless moment. Nabira's form flickered, destabilized, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty in her eyes. "You cannot erase what was sung," she said quietly. I answered her with the only truth I had ever trusted. "No," I said, "but I can refuse to keep singing it." The silence that followed was deeper than any sound that had come before. Slowly her shape began to dissolve, not into smoke but into distance, as though she were being pulled backward across impossible miles of time and memory. Isaiah collapsed beside me unconscious, his body finally his own again. When I opened my eyes again the next morning, the apartment was ordinary once more, though cracked slightly at the edges like a dream not fully forgotten. The sand was gone. The radio was gone. Only the smell of distant desert wind remained faintly in the air. Isaiah survived, but he never played trumpet again in the same way. Some nights I hear him humming quietly under his breath, and I know he is remembering something he cannot name. Harlem continued its music as if nothing had happened. Clubs still singing, horns still crying, people still laughing through pain. But I know better now that sound is never only sound. It is a doorway. And some doors never fully close. I still sit by my window as Mama Otomba, listening to the city breathe, and sometimes in the deepest parts of night, when jazz floats soft and broken through the streets, I swear I hear a distant drum answering from somewhere far beneath the world, waiting patiently for the next ear, willing to forget what it hears.